Welcome to this panel discussion on artificial persons, breakthroughs in AI and personhood. This is part of Lund University's Future Week, and my name is Eduardo Gil Pedro, and I'm a researcher at the law faculty at the University of Lund, and I'm also the coordinator of the Advanced Study Group on Artificial Persons, which is the group that has organized this panel discussion. It's really nice to actually see people face to face. It's been a while, so this is a very novel, feels quite novel and refreshing experience. I should warn you, though, that this is also being, as you can see, being streamed at the same time, and the streaming is being recorded. So those of you in the audience are not being filmed, but the sound is being picked up. So you should be aware of that if you want to say something compromising or in any way that you don't want shared and recorded. I'm going to first of all introduce the panel. Then Dr. Jonnie Penn is going to say, give a short talk, and then we're going to have the panel discussion. So first of all, the panel, we are all in this panel members of this advanced study group on artificial persons, and we have Valentin Joitner, who is from the Faculty of Law. We have Blashenka Sher from the Center for Theology and Religious Studies. We have Jacek Malik from the Department of Computer Science, and we've got Gabriela Alina Sarciuc from the Department of Cognitive Science. We've also had a fifth member of the panel, which is in the program, but unfortunately was not able to make it today, Eric Persson from the Department of Philosophy. But we also have, very importantly, we have Dr. Jonnie Penn, whom I'll introduce more fully in a short while, from the Department of History and Philosophy at Cambridge University. But before I introduce Jonnie, I just wanted to say a few words about the Advanced Study Group, who we are, what we do. Advanced study groups, they're set up and they are funded by the Pufendorf Institute, which is based in this building. And the idea of these groups is to encourage interdisciplinary research and study between researchers based at the Faculty of Law. And this particular advanced study group brings together researchers from 9 different institutions. So as well as the 5 members of the group that we have here, there's 8 others who are participate in the study with the group from altogether 9 different departments. And the subject that we study is artificial persons. The first kind of artificial person that we're interested in is entities that deploy artificial intelligence, AI. These don't necessarily need to be sort of humanoid robots or things that look or sound in any way like human beings. They can be self-driving cars, they can be industrial robots, they can be purely digital entities like an algorithm that conducts trading on the stock exchange, or an algorithm that decides which films you should see or should be recommended to you on your streaming platform. So these kinds of entities that deploy artificial intelligence and function in some way in our society, in our world. There are already discussions that some of these AIs should be considered, or perhaps all of these AIs should be considered legal persons. Some consider that if an AI causes harm, if you're hurt, for instance, by a self-driving car, that you should be able to hold the AI responsible. You should be able to sue the self-driving car as well as, or instead of, the driver or the maker of the car. There's also discussions that as AI becomes increasingly sophisticated and autonomous, perhaps AI should be given rights in some way. AI should be considered, should be count in some way as a person in our society when we make decisions about how to live our lives together. And this idea that we're introducing these artificial beings, artificial persons into our world and treating them in some way as persons might seem quite disconcerting. It might seem quite strange, a bit sci-fi, maybe even scary for some people. So it sort of leads us to wonder, what would it be like to share our world with artificial persons? Well, as luck would have it, we already share our world with artificial persons, and that is the insight that sort of sets up the framework for the study that this group does, is that we already have in our society, in our world, beings which are artificial but are considered persons. And these are legal persons, corporate legal persons. So companies, they are legal persons under the law. They own property, they have rights and responsibilities, they can sue and be sued, they can be held responsible for their actions. And they're beyond the law, they might also be said to function as persons in our social and economic and political world. We work for companies, we buy things from companies, we depend on companies in order to be able to function. We ask the advice of companies on how to organize our economy and our society. We have complex relationships with companies. We trust companies. We are loyal to companies. We like some companies. We don't like other companies. So we already have these beings, these persons in our world with whom we have these complex relationships. And perhaps if we want to understand what it means to share our legal, economic, social world with other kinds of artificial beings, we can learn a lot from studying companies and how we interact and exist with companies in our world. This group has two kind of broad and related questions. The first one is to ask, what does the experience of living with these kind of artificial persons teach us about personhood? What does personhood entail? What does it consist of? What are the implications of granting personhood? And to what extent can we as human beings exercise control over artificial persons? So we use these other kinds of artificial persons as a sort of model or as a sort of example of how we interact with persons and what kind of beings artificial persons might be. And the second related question is, what might the implications be of handing responsibility for the development and operation of artificial intelligence and the creation of these entities that may become persons or may be treated as persons, when a lot of the responsibility and the power to develop and deploy these AIs is in the hands of artificial persons, of companies. Most of the leading developments in AI at the moment are taking place in companies like Google, like Alphabet. Well, Alphabet is Google, but Amazon or IBM, NVIDIA. So a very wide range, Facebook, of corporate persons that are designing and deploying artificial intelligence to serve their own ends. So we have here a situation where artificial persons are designing and controlling artificial intelligence that could gain the status of a person in order to serve the interests of another artificial person. So artificial persons controlling artificial persons. So we consider what the implications of that might be. And we are at the very early stages of this investigation. So this group started functioning in January. We've had some meetings and we've thought through some of the issues. So we don't have answers to any of these questions yet. We're starting to try and figure out what might be the interesting questions that we could ask, specific questions, and also how we might go about asking such questions. To that end, we've asked a number of scholars to engage with our work and to help us think through some of these issues. Our first speaker that we had about a month ago was the Archbishop of Sweden, Dr. Antje Jacqueline. We had Professor Marco Ventura 2 weeks ago, and we're going to have Susan Schneider from the Florida Atlantic University in a month's time. But today we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Jonnie Penn. And Dr. Penn is a historian of information technology. He is an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School. He's a research fellow at St. Edmund's College, Cambridge University. He's a New York Times best-selling author and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And he has held prior fellowships at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, at Google, one of these legal persons we're looking into, and at the British National Academy of Writing. So please, Jonnie Penn.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and to all of you for being here, and for the Pufendorf Advanced Group on Artificial Persons for your invitation to participate in this panel and in this working group. I will offer 2 exploratory ideas, or rather provocations, for our conversation today. The first is a vignette from the early days of artificial intelligence that highlights the field's entanglements with the histories of administration, capitalism, and operations research. This episode calls to mind AI's conceptual debts to the study of social phenomena, not neural phenomena. Second, I relate this episode to some introductory remarks on the need to change the law to reflect how we socialize with corporations and with AI. To my first point, this is the historical vignette. The logic theory machine was a proto-computer program developed at the Rand Corporation in 1955 and 56 by 3 men, Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and J. Clifford Shaw. It's described by popular histories of the field as the first AI program, the first working AI program. And the trio's aim was to model human problem solving using the electronic computer, which in 1956 they claimed to have accomplished. The system could discover and construct proof from Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's magnum opus Principia Mathematica. Now, this is a rather long and technical story that I must compress here due to time and to meet the kind of subject area that we are gathered here to explore. In short, to skip back 2 decades before the logic theory machine was developed, Herbert Simon, who you may know as a Nobel Prize winning economist, was at the time a political scientist at the University of Chicago in the 1930s and 40s. And he inherited from the study of political science in Chicago at that time a kind of positivist view of the social sciences. Simon set out to create what he called a scientific theory of administration, one amenable to systematic observation and experimentation. In 1947, he published Administrative Behavior, which offered an economic model of decision-making in organizations. Ironically, given his ambitions, this account was not deeply rooted in empirical evidence, nor were its primary influences. Still, it went on to become one of the most influential management books of the 20th century. I want to focus on one contribution from administrative behavior that Simon offered, which he called decision premises. And with this idea, he built on work by John R. Commons, a labor economist, who in the 30s developed the notion of working rules, which are the frame of reference which every organization implicitly set for its membership. So this is how Commons described it. Working rules are continually changing in the history of an institution, and they differ for different institutions. They are sometimes known as maxims of conduct. Adam Smith names them canons. Whatever their differences and different names, they have this similarity, that they indicate what individuals can, must, or may do or not do. For Simon, those who sat higher up in the hierarchy of an organization could influence those below by framing the decision premises, his version of working rules, of the lower employees. With this, he provided a framework on which to build a science of decision-making in an organization. But it was narrow. It was primarily an economic model of decision-making. And he conceded that separate from profit as a kind of maximizing rule, he said this scheme needs to be modified somewhat to fit voluntary, religious, and governmental organizations. So it was kind of a for-profit model. 5 years later, and this is where we enter the AI piece of this conversation, in 1952, Simon was hired to consult in the new systems research laboratory of the Rand Corporation, a think tank funded by the US Air Force to develop mathematical techniques that would aid in the emerging Cold War. Rand owned and operated one of the largest installations of scientific computing in the world in the early 1950s. And Simon, with his new collaborators, was interested in how a computer could be used to model non-numerical computations, or stated differently, how complex behavior could be generated from simpler sub-processes. What the group lacked was a language or coherent framework with which to interact with the machine. They wanted to play chess, but this proved it and tried to devise a language with propositional calculus that would allow a computer to play chess with any kind of ability, but that failed. Solutions came from two areas. The first, and this is what I study or I offer in my doctoral dissertation, if of interest. Simon borrowed from administrative behavior the notion of decision premises, which allowed him to kind of close the world in which he sought to formalize. As for a for-profit organization, the logic theory machine leveraged means-ends analysis, which compared an initial state to a goal state to grade the desirability of one option versus another. The goal state they selected was to discover, as I said, and construct proofs from Principia Mathematica. The benefit of this approach was that Principia made explicit the basic and primitive rules according to which deductive reasoning proceeded. So it provided further kind of language for them to formalize and encode in the machine. It provided a system and notation to simulate human problem solving. And by the winter of 1956, the logic theory machine had been used to prove 38 of 52 theorems from Principia Mathematica. The legacy, I argue, is that it equated human problem solving with formal logic. And one way you can see this is how the group chose to publish their work, these kind of remarkable accomplishments. First of all, although they knew about artificial intelligence, which was kind of beginning to come together at that same time in which they were in conversation with early movers in that area, they refused to call this artificial intelligence. They called it instead complex information processing. And they rebuffed the notion that problem solving was tied to biology. The words brain and mind do not figure in their early papers, except when they are mentioned as explicitly unrelated to the logic theory machine. So in short, the empirical source they sought to model was social, not neural. The logic theory machine emulated human behavior, not human biology. Why do I bring this to your attention? In a lecture to the Operations Research Society of America given in 1957, a year after the Dartmouth Summer Research Project gave AI its name and brought together its initial membership, Simon and Newell positioned the logic theory machine as a contribution to operations research, a form of scientific warfare and administration. They wrote, or spoke, as Simon said in the address, "For an appropriate patron saint of our profession, we can most appropriately look back a full half century before Frederick Taylor, the father of scientific management, to the remarkable figure of Charles Babbage, the British industrialist. He, Babbage, was one of the strongest mathematicians of his generation, but he devoted his career to the improvement of manufacturing arts." Simon continued, "Physicists and electrical engineers had little to do with the invention of the digital computer. The real inventor was the economist Adam Smith, whose ideas were translated into hardware through successive stages of development by Prony and Babbage." Simon's point was that, in his view, computation was a social phenomenon first and a technological phenomenon second. Adam Smith outlined the social phenomenon, capitalism, from which Prony and Babbage derived their computational techniques. This is Simon's judgment. And I could say more here about how the logic theory machine helped to legitimize AI in this foundational period, despite living under a different moniker. Given that our focus is artificial persons, I want to instead go to the broader entanglement between calculation, organizations, and cognition. With this in mind, let's revisit the history that Simon saw himself as having contributed to with the logic theory machine, the supposed first prototype of AI. Inspired by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the French mathematician and engineer Gaspard de Prony set out in 1791 to bring uniformity to state records by producing precise logarithmic tables. To do so, he subverted the high regard that computation held in French culture at the time. He instead organized laborers as if in a factory to, in his words, manufacture logarithms as one manufactures pins. The historian Lorraine Daston charts this broad historical phenomenon as the separation of calculation from genius during the rapid industrialization of the early 19th century. Daston described the emergence of what she calls managerial intelligence that rewarded those with the executive capacity to harness, e.g. manage or command, human computers. Computers were, of course, initially human, as epitomized by the lucrative insurance trade, growing government bureaucracies, and in the actuarial sciences. As an example of Daston's point, Deprony wrote that a definitive lack of intelligence was desirable amongst this new class of workers calculating his charts, since they would not question the rote labor required to produce the tables. Charles Babbage, the industrial designer behind the difference engine, an early mechanical calculator, shared a similar view. Babbage, the historian Simon Schaffer tells us, saw cognition as akin to a factory. The resource in this case was not individual genius, but in a sense collective conformity, a theory of intelligence that conveniently maintained the political status quo. There's a lot more I can say here, but just to keep it moving, the notion of maintaining the political status quo provides an entryway into understanding AI as a conservative force in the world, rather than a democratizing or revolutionary set of technologies. To understand this conservatism, one must consider the chronic amorphousness of the term artificial intelligence. The list of technical practices to have traveled under this label since the term was introduced is inconsistent. There was symbolic AI in the 1950s to 70s, expert systems in the 1970s to 1990s, and machine learning from the 1990s to 2020s, or so the kind of textbook histories of AI go. The irony is that machine learning, that concept predates AI, as the historian Aaron Mendel-Plasek helps to show today. AI in contemporary and popular dialogue masquerades as many things. It's a single discipline, a set of disciplines, a claim to the limits of consciousness, a manufacturing philosophy, and a utopian statistical toolset. The list continues. AI as manufacturing philosophy does perhaps the best job of capturing what AI actually is out there in the world. As is true of skyscrapers, of power plants, and of the internet, and of other large technological systems, the actualization of artificial intelligence, meaning its day-to-day use, calls upon a phenomenal number of contingencies: copper heat sinks, cobalt mines, sub-gig economies, LiDAR sensors, CCTV, server warehouses, broad smartphone penetration, et cetera, et cetera. AI in practice is anything but an abstraction. These inputs are simply not accounted for in most popular narratives about AI. In their visualization of what is required to create and operate an Amazon Echo, Crawford and Yoler provide a glimpse of the sheer density of materials and labor that make up the AI supply chain. Much of this exists in the cloud, a friendly misnomer for a set of network data centers. The historian Nathan Ensminger states that if the cloud were a country, it would be the seventh highest consumer of electricity globally. This is a glimpse into AI's material lives, a vast, globally situated ecological footprint that rests upon numerous entangled ideological commitments simultaneously: global governance, racial capitalism, mass surveillance, data positivism, faith in political modernity. The list continues. In the search for how to control, or depending on your persuasion, unleash AI, we collectively question a consequential intersection: the future of AI and legal personhood. In the words of David Runciman, who's just stepped down as the head of the political science department in Cambridge, many of the fears that people now have about the coming age of intelligent robots are the same ones we have had about corporations for hundreds of years. The worry, he implies, is that these are systems we never really learned how to control. Well, I agree with Runciman, as my historical vignette shows, that these subjects are deeply entangled. I disagree with him about that lack of control. This narrative, I fear, indulges that which it diagnoses, that these its, be they corporations or AI, somehow outrank humankind and can outmaneuver us. The problem, in my view, is one of socialization. We have been told the wrong stories about what AI is. Let's consider an alternative account of why we are in this room today. In his paper, Manufacturing the AI Revolution, Yarden Katz traces contemporary hullabaloo about AI, which launched, for many of us, this circle has kept us busy for the last few years, for good reasons and not. Katz traces this to measurable investments made by large technology companies in the 2010s. These investments, which prompted this kind of resurgence of interest in machine learning and AI, were made to rebrand staid data science techniques as AI to improve sales. In her programmable infrastructures project, Stata Gerses goes further. She traces investment in cloud technologies after the 2008 financial crisis. With the integrity of real estate investments in question, ICE and investment turned to big tech for reliable returns. Unable to make those returns on internet advertising as a business model, Silicon Valley set out to harvest IT budgets globally by making small and medium-sized companies reliant on the cloud. It is this line of investigation that triggers some to believe that cloud economics is the next bubble to burst. Okay, so AI has a material footprint and it has a political economy. What do we do about that? The historian John Agar defines technology as designed material means to an end. He adds that the essence of technology is the ability to intervene across scales. A bicycle intervenes across the scales of distance, making it easier to travel at a speed that the human body could not as easily reach on its own. A refrigerator intervenes across the thermodynamic scale, allowing humans access to cooler temperatures. A lamp intervenes across the scale of luminosity, brightening spaces that might otherwise be dark. Elsewhere, Wendy Chun argues that that we should see race as a technology, since that shifts one focus from the what of race to the how of race, from knowing race to doing race, by emphasizing the similarities between race and technology. Race, Chun argues, is neither purely biological nor purely cultural. It is and has been performed, negotiated, and reestablished through technological mediation. Following Bruce Dane, Chen writes, race first denoted a group of people connected by common descent, e.g. a noble house or family. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the era of exploration, race roughly corresponded to geographical groups of people marked by supposedly common physical characteristics, i.e. the English race. In the 18th century, it designated all humankind in distinction to animals, as well as the subspecies of Homo sapiens. As science moved from 18th century natural history, which based its species classifications on visible structures, to 19th century science, which pursued the invisible processes of life itself, race became an even more important means by which the visible and invisible were interlinked. Does this amorphous meaning and stubborn decisive power sound familiar? In his 2020 book, Artificial Whiteness, Katz argues, to quote the reviewer George Lipsig, that the artifice of whiteness provides the organizing logic of AI and enables its racist and capitalist ideological projects to be disguised as socially neutral technological imperatives, similarly to how eugenics emerged before. Some may see these questions as far removed from our present subject. This assumption, I think, however, or I offer, would be a mistake. I'm going to lean here now to conclude on intersectionality theory, which provides a framework by which to understand the nuances of personhood. I am not an expert in intersectionality by any sense, but I just offer it as a path for us to collectively explore with other experts. Intersectionality asks us to be accountable to the environments and knowledge systems we are situated within, to notice rather than deny their nuances and complexity. Intersectionality expressed at the level of legal personhood would allow a similar process of socialization to occur with the invisible beasts who surround us and often dictate the nature of the environments we inhabit. It allows us to use pronouns across scales, in a sense, to relate to decision systems based on their character. What is the character of a corporation? The central premise, and I'm almost at the end here, of the award-winning 2003 documentary, The Corporation, was that a firm's fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder profit compelled it to carry out, quote, psychopathic, end quote, behavior. They arrived at that term, psychopathic, via reference to the diagnostic criteria of psychiatry's official rulebook, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-4 in this case. The criteria included reckless disregard for the safety of others, deceitfulness, incapacity to experience guilt, disregard for the feeling of other people, incapacity to maintain human relationships, and failure to conform to social norms and respect the law. In a 2015 article for The Atlantic entitled, If Corporations Are People, They Should Act Like It, Kent Greenfield, a professor of corporate law at Boston College, argues for co-determined board structures that require representation of both shareholders and employees. He cites a senior managing director of the US investment firm Blackstone Group as having argued that co-determination was one of the factors that allowed Germany to avoid the worst of the financial crisis. So if a corporation were to be more like people, or corporations were to be more like people, what sort of people should they be like? It is difficult, I unfortunately find myself in the position to make this proposal in English. I understand through the teaching of Indigenous scholars and activists that the English language is ill-equipped to communicate complex information, relational information like of this type. Some indigenous languages, in comparison, offer far more nuance and depth for how to relate to what we in English describe as, our reality. Consider the words of the author Robin Wall Kimmerer, who writes, "In English, we never refer to a person as it. Such a grammatical error would be a profound act of disrespect. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reducing a person to a thing. And yet, in English, we speak of our beloved grandmother Earth in exactly that way, as it. The language allows no form of respect for the more than human beings with whom we share the earth. In English, a being is either a human or an it. We are," Kimmerer reminds us, "surrounded by intelligences other than our own. Grammar is one way to measure and adjudicate our respect for those beings. What would it mean to connect how we relate to corporations to how we enshrine their status in law? I see existing corporations as akin to teenagers, members of our society who we accept as unruly given their journey to maturity. The aim then is to graduate corporations out of this sanctioned psychopathic realm once they become adequately mature. Facebook, for example, in my view, should no longer be a corporation. It should be something else, perhaps something closer to utility. But broadly, what I'm arguing for here is kind of gradients for us to kind of democratically discuss what those could be and to enrich our language for how we describe and relate to them. Well, without these relations in place, and this is where I'll end, we will continue to glorify and naturalize capitalist logics through computational procedures. Our species, sadly, will not likely survive this hubris. It is suicide to model personhood for AIs on corporate personhood, given the failings of the latter. We must shutter this chapter of capitalism before it shutters us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonnie, for those very inspiring, thought-provoking, interesting observations. I think it gives us food for thought. Maybe I can start by asking you a question, because you refer to corporations as unruly teenagers, as well as potentially psychopaths, and you caution us very strongly against modeling AI on corporations. How would then what would be a good model for a person, of an artificial intelligence person?
I think so. I didn't mean to suggest as that corporations in their current, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so these are provocations from my discipline. But I don't believe that corporations can't hold the sort of social entitlements they have today. I think I'm arguing for more of a pluralism of approaches. I think that a company, let's say the size of Facebook, is too large to operate purely for a profit motive. And in the same way that we relate to people of a certain age as free to fail, we should allow for corporations of a certain size to be free to kind of make mistakes, and some of those mistakes may be egregious. But the social license we offer to them should change depending on where they are, what their level of stakes are and their behavior. Yeah. And I think intersectionality and kind of current debate around pronouns offers a glimpse into how we struggle in our current societies, plural, to, recapture modes of relating that are more in tune with how we identify, as opposed to how we are meant to identify. So that's why I think it'd be useful to bring to the scale of corporations, is to start to hold them accountable to how they behave and how we might want them to behave. Thank you.
I think it might be helpful to sort of pull back a little bit and go to back down to basics of the concept of the person. I think it might be helpful for the audience, as well as for us. And maybe I can start with a question of, because you sort of made a parallel in your presentation between, human beings and their characteristics, and corporations, their characteristics, AI and their characteristics, and sort of teenagehood psychopathy. To what extent, and maybe I'll start with Gabriela, does an entity need to share human characteristics in order to be a person? And just as an introduction, Gabriela works with great apes at the Furuvik non-human great apes, sorry. So can you tell us, is there a relationship between personhood and human characteristics, and does it play out also in the animal realm?
I think that history tells us is that this requirement would be rather actually insignificant. We nowadays have persons that do not share much human characteristics with humans, such as rivers or even corporations, although there is a bit debatable. But on the other hand, we have these creatures, the non-human great apes, which are so closely related to us that biologically that we can actually receive blood from them if we are in need of that. So closely are we related to them, and that is also reflected in the kind of cognitive traits that we share with them. And there have been a number of trials trying to acquire personhood for a number of individual chimpanzees and orangutans, propelled by very, very practical reasons, towards reclassifying these individuals rather than property, as they were classified maybe 10, 20 years ago, into persons, in order to allow their transfer from very restrictive housing conditions to a sanctuary where species appropriate behaviors could be expressed. And sadly, these proceedings failed, although the plea for personhood in this case, for granting these apes the status of person in order to be transferred to proper housing conditions, was grounded on arguments that were drawn from legal writings, which stress the significance of cognitive traits, such as reason or the ability to be aware of self, of reflect upon self, or the ability to put yourself onto the shoes of another, which is what cognitive scientists call theory of mind, that is understanding the mental state of others, that others have feelings and what kind of feelings they have, that they have intentions or beliefs and find out what kind of beliefs they have. And non-human great apes actually have a lot of this, and these pleas were grounded on very, very solid scientific evidence, yet they failed. So yeah, well, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, and that ties with Jonnie's point that there are two categories. There are persons and there are its, and animals at this stage fall in the it category.
I think there was one of these trials happened in Austria, and it brought about something very important that Austria, it's the case of the chimpanzee Hyasel, Austria then moved on to develop some kind of animal rights. So that was a bit of a progress, but no, to legal personhood, it apparently doesn't matter. But that also reflects upon AI. There is a strive to, at least in certain scientific programs, to build human-like AI, and perhaps the relevance of shared cognitive characteristics could come into play when discussing the personhood of that type of AI. But yeah, AIs are so many kinds that I don't think there is it can be one personhood, and definitely not tailored based on, not necessarily tailored based on the human model and the model of natural persons.
Blashenka, you are an expert in Old Testament writings. Does the Bible tell us anything useful about who is or should be or could be a person? A little question like that.
Well, actually, listening to you, Gabriela, I think the texts do say something similar, actually. because texts in antiquity about the creation of humans are very much alike the story of the creation of the AI. There is this matter that we create, that gods create an entity that will relieve them from their work. Of course, that's the Atrahasis epic, and also Enuma Elish, the old Babylonian epic. And then they breathe, or they put the piece of blood or something in them, and thereby they animate them, and they become persons that can move and do things that are created for. And also in the Hebrew Bible, it's a similar story. But interestingly now, when I listen to you, there are two stories of the creation of human being in the Hebrew Bible, which are initially in both the first two chapters. And the first one is more biological, and it actually speaks of the creation of the human couple in biological terms as Zahar and Nekeva, which doesn't mean a man and a woman, but it means a he and a she. So it's gendered, and it's the same pair of words that are used of animals as well. And in the second, the very famous Adam and Eve story of Eden's story, the term that is used of a person, if we should say a living person, is nephesh. But nephesh is also used of animals. So that is actually, if you look, of course, that religious traditions do not build on texts, but they build on discussions that are very much influenced by Greek thinking, for instance. And Greek thinking is dualistic. So when these texts are translated to Greek, they are translated into this dualistic language. I'm glad that you picked up that aspect of the thing. And then, the human person becomes something that is dualistic, made of matter and some inner stuff that is its soul or intelligence or whatever have you, as if that's something that it's stuff that we have inside us, and animals don't. Would many people say that in the tradition? But the text actually, this text in antiquity, think more like evolutionary biologists, I would say, than religious traditions. That's just a few thoughts on what we discussed.
Can we turn to the lawyer? Valentin, legal persons, we heard a lot about them. To what extent are human characteristics or the presence of humans relevant for the personhood of legal persons? Can you?
Yes. I think, first of all, it depends, of course, as most things do in law, on the legal system we are working with. So I'm an English lawyer by training and an international lawyer nowadays most of the time. And each system might have a different answer, so it's difficult to provide general legal answers to these questions. But I think, in principle, from a legal point of view, anything that we want to be a person can be a person. It's quite a creative art, maybe counterintuitively. The law can attach any kind of label it likes. And it does, as we've seen with the corporations, and animals historically have been persons too from time to time. It changes. Sometimes objects can be persons. We have mentioned the rivers, the trees. So if there is a lawmaker that decides to call it such, then it is that. So I think it's difficult to find an essential core of what it means to be a person in law. Yeah, because at least if you think about it in positivistic terms, as in terms where you say that the law is posited by those who create the law. To look into natural law theories, maybe if you adopt a more essentializing approach where you try to actually connect legal concepts to an actually existing core, it might get more tricky. But I think by default, lawyers can call things whatever they like to call them. And what happens if there is a mismatch between the legal vision and the reality as it exists on the grounds is that you happen to have revolutions, for example, or that people clearly start disrespecting the law, and that normally for a lawmaker is an indication here legal form mismatches reality. And then you have to, if you want to survive as a system, modify the norms. But you can go quite far, and maybe corporations is an example before that happens.
Jacek, our computer science expert in this panel, when you think about the design and implementation of autonomous AI, to what extent are human beings a model, and whether also maybe whether you relate at all to what Jonnie was saying about how corporations and corporate rationality touch on that, those two.
Well, I would say that there are two ways of thinking about that. One way is, well, pure engineering. We are trying to build tools that are useful, that are helping humankind one way or another. When we are creating a trading agent for the stock exchange, we are just trying to help some traders in their job to do it better. When we are creating systems that detect cancer in pictures, we are just trying to help, well, both patients and doctors in their work. So from that perspective, it's just a utility for, well, some group of, well, not necessarily people, but for someone that counts. But of course, on the other hand, there is this interest in what, at least in my case, intelligence is. I'm quite afraid of using the term personhood because it's much farther than even intelligence that cannot be so easily defined. So when I create the systems, AI systems, and in particular when I'm thinking about the robots that should, or I would like to show, to exhibit some kind of intelligence, and I'm trying to find out what distinguishes this intelligence or this property that I would like to capture. And of course, it's as Jonnie said in his talk, it's behavior that counts. It's not biology, so how the system is constructed, but rather the behavior that we evaluate when we look at when we interact with a system. It's always behavior that I don't even know whether you have any mind. I just evaluate it on the basis of your behavior. So, and it's quite convenient theory to assume you have, but and so this is the way we are treating artifacts we are creating. We are just trying to create behavior that would, well, show that there is some kind of mind behind it, or there is some kind of, well, there is some intelligence revealed by it. But what I would like to also connect to is Valentin's statement that law can label anything we want. It's the same situation we have here. In a sense, we are not, well, we can, or the law is, in my opinion, a convenience. We are creating some legal rules in order to facilitate or to make our life, social life, well, smoother, well, better. This is the set of rules that we think should be obeyed, or sometimes this is this, as post fact, we are trying to create those rules that we think are already existing in the society. Here we have the same situation. We are, in a sense, creating systems with, well, be it the logic theorist, this is the set of rules that we think that logical reasoning should follow. And of course, there is even discussion whether the logic that has been introduced in Principia Mathematica is the right way to describe all the logical thinking Probably it isn't, it's just the subset. But this way we are capturing some aspect of it. And then it's in the observer's eye whether we attribute some property, some diffuse or some property that is hard to capture in the definition, like intelligence or like personhood to it. So this is my engineer's point of view on the topic.
Thank you. Jonnie, can I turn to you and just ask whether, from your knowledge of the history of how AI was developed in that period that you were describing in your talk, was personhood at any point part of the discussion? Was it even sort of considered that these entities that were being created, this technology that was being developed, could become or had any connection with persons and personhood?
Well, so the first kind of school of thought in AI was symbolic AI, and John McCarthy, who coined the term AI and was a kind of important figure, he organized the conference that gave the field its name and was very influential in the field in the second half of the 20th century. He said in his diary, I quote this often, that he thought that epistemology, the study of knowledge, would reduce to a branch of applied mathematics. And he said the way we do that is through programming, because programming will take all the kind of fluff out of philosophy and just give us a way to test theories of mind. And this overlapped the origins of cognitive science. You know, this group in AI were at similar conferences, and there are figures that move between the two fields. This school of AI is also not as popular as it was, you know, like machine learning and sub-symbolic AI connectionism is why we talk about AI today, deep learning. And there are industrial reasons, as I alluded to as well, for it being kind of vogue. But, you know, machine learning, which is basically statistics on steroids, okay, I've got the nod. You know, is not, in the machine learning conferences I go to, the contemporary conferences I go to today, or papers I read, that many in that area aren't necessarily interested in the theory of intelligence the way that those early founders of AI were. Marvin Minsky's wife said that, Marvin Minsky's another kind of founder of AI, said that he would roll in his grave to see AI today, because researchers weren't doing that kind of, in his view, kind of basic research of what is a theory of intelligence, how can we use computers to prove it. It's more instrumental these days. As was described, it's about solving problems. And so this is why I think there's a danger. One of the reasons I think there's a danger to look to corporate, or to think of corporate personhood and AI as kind of justifying one another in what we think of as a person. It's too narrow of a problem. We have to think of, well, why would we introduce personhood to AIs in the first place? Presumably it's to let our species survive. So climate change is one, you know, immediate thing that we might need to update our whole legal system to accommodate. And another is, you know, racial justice globally, and another is procedural justice, because I think we're witnessing in the last 2 years, especially, that like what is in the law and who gets the protections that are in the law are very different things. And so AI is, in addition to being this kind of honeypot, interesting area to study philosophically and from many different positions, it's also being used to process how we get mortgages, what healthcare we get, you know, whether we get into universities, et cetera, et cetera. And so to make sure that we have the kind of, basically, all of what I'm saying is to try and take a holistic approach, which is sort of an easy answer, but I would also defend what I think is the kind of right holistic approach.
Thank you. And I think on that holistic note, I think we need to feed our bodies, not just our minds, and we're going to take a short break. Welcome once more, refreshed and reinvigorated, and to talk some more about artificial persons. And one question that I wanted to ask sort of to everyone to pitch in, who feels inclined, is whether sort of two related questions. One is person one concept or is it several? And is person as a concept a binary concept, a bit like pregnant? You're either it or you're not. Or is it more of a sort of scale of personhood, a bit like intelligence, that you can be a little intelligent or a lot intelligent? So is it one concept, or does it relate to, does it depend on which discipline you come from? And if in any event, is it binary or a matter of scale? Anybody who has any views on that?
Well, at least from my perspective, there are at least two, if not more, concepts of personhood. One is Alina's point of view, the biological one, where we have this, I would say we have this spectrum. So we are more keen on assigning personhood to people than to great apes, than to small apes, than to worms, for example. So there is this. While in legal case, the legal point of view, there we have, well, either it is or not. The definition tells us whether something, or either some artifact and some construction, or some person is a legal person or not. And so I would say that from my perspective, there is the problem of, in a sense, in our discussions, maybe not problem, maybe the virtue of our discussions, is that we are trying to identify this concept of personhood, coming with different ideas, different points of view, and confronting them with each other. So that's my. I don't even think we are able to agree upon one single definition of personhood, but it's good that we can at least express those different ones and see their relation.
Gabriela.
Yeah, that's I agree to this multiple perspective view and multiple concepts view. And I think what I could add, it's about the gradient, the question of whether this is a binary concept or not. I'm thinking that one perspective is that of personhood as a kind of a social contract where an entity is granted both rights and protection on one side, and then also has some obligations to fulfill. And I'm thinking that how us human evolve into that or develop into that, since up to a certain age, we only have the right side, and then something changes and we become fully fledged persons that also have obligations and are accountable in front of the law. So I think that contributes a bit to how we look at this question.
Yeah, Valentin.
Yeah.
Talking of the law.
Yes, so I think as a lawyer, normally concepts are one. So that's as a term of art, but beyond the law, of course, there are many concepts. I think law also has a tendency to like binary distinctions because they stabilize communication, they stabilize social interaction, even if in reality things are often not binary. A very obvious example is the discussions on questions concerning transgender, for example. Is there one gender, two gender, one sex, multiple sexes? And laws struggle with this. You can only click, and we see this very often sometimes when you buy flight tickets or something, you still have to click one or the other. Nobody really knows why, actually, but that's how it works. And then you have to have a third category that covers all of this. You could also have a spectrum, like where you just choose, like you regulate your volume. In any case, but in law, still you have, especially in international law, which I teach most of the time, you have an awareness that there can be maybe there's one concept of personhood, but it can have a range of consequences, or the range of entitlements you can have can vary. So in international law, you have states. Maybe the archetype of a legal subject is the state. They have the most rights and the most obligations. But you can also have non-recognized entities, maybe like Taiwan or Northern Cyprus. You can have individuals like us. We have human rights, but we don't have many more rights, so we don't have the same kinds of obligations. You have organizations like the UN, a lot of rights, a lot of obligations, but it's not a state, so it's further removed from that archetype. And there's, or you have terrorist groups, so all kinds of actors. And international law is quite aware that you might call them person. They are all legal persons in some sense, but the consequences that flow from them can be quite different.
Shall we move to the implications of personhood and what flows from being a person in how an entity is treated and interacts with society? Is anybody that wants to volunteer some thoughts on that?
To repeat the question.
So what are the implications of personhood? What does it mean? Why does it matter to regard an entity as a person or not?
I can try. Again, looking at, I look at the old narratives, of course, that narratives that tell us how humans thought about themselves and the world a couple of thousands of years ago. And then the term personhood doesn't apply, of course, because there is no such thing in these texts, at least that I'm familiar with. But there are other things, and and I think in our discussion, when we discuss personhood, we always think about human personhood as a norm, so to speak, and then out of how we understand human personhood, we talk about the rivers or trees or corporations or AI entities as persons. But if we look at what implies, does it mean to be a human person in antiquity, it's not, I hope I don't swear in the church, as we say, but it's not so much what we are, what we contain possibly within our bodies, but what we do. That's the essence of human personhood in antiquity, in these texts that I study, and what we do is one basic thing. We govern the world, not in the way that we just fulfill our desires by governing, but we govern the world. We are responsible for the world to remain an ordered area in cosmos, because it's easy to make it chaotic, of course, all kinds of disasters, but it's human responsibility to keep the world an ordered place for life to flourish. So human life and non-human life, and also nature in general. So that's what defines a human person, I would say, this day. That's the most basic characteristic of a human person. That's how people view themselves. It's my responsibility to keep the world in order. And then they have an ideology of how that is best done. But this is the implication of human personhood in those texts.
And that would tie in with your idea of a teenager growing up, perhaps, that if entities are to be persons in the full sense, then they need to have this sense of responsibility for the order. Is that my correct interpretation, Blashenka? That it's your task to uphold the order.
For life to flourish.
For life to flourish.
I would say, more than just a sense of responsibility, but like legal, your very existence as a corporation relies on that those set of duties. And to your initial questions, I've been thinking about the two prior questions about, is personhood a binary, and what would it mean to have gradients of personhood? I think that the peculiar situation we find ourselves in here, again, I'm a historian, so I understand these things over long time scales, and people find that jarring sometimes because I often try and articulate what I see as like solutions that match the scale of the problems that we found ourselves in is, will we call the Enlightenment if it leads to the end of our species? Like if we fetishize rationality to such a point that we are obsessed with the instruments that remove us from the world that we require sustenance from, I would laugh if we, I don't think it would be called the Enlightenment. And so to look at like a concept like intelligence and optimize for intelligence, which is not a very old, scientifically, it's not a very old idea, and it's problematic. There is no set theory of intelligence that I'm aware of in any field. There are multiple different versions. So just if we were going to imprint off like the best science, we would, I assume, take multiple versions of intelligence and try and, put that plurality into conversation so that, there's kind of equilibrium. But yeah, so I guess that would be my answer to the, like, is something intelligent or not intelligent? Like, absolutely no. That's a dangerous way, I think, of looking at it. And I guess I'm not convinced either that humans are as special as we think they are, because if we look at so what would if enlightenment is treated in this continent and in where I'm from too, in North America, as kind of a pedigree worth reproducing, and that now is thrown into question because of the climate scenario we're in, what alternative civilization should we look to? Well, again, where I'm from, indigenous cultures survived for tens of thousands of years without disruption, in equilibrium with nature, with sophisticated ways of storytelling that would pass knowledge down between generations often without artifacts, just oral traditions through song and things to compress ideas about where to get food and water and et cetera, et cetera. The point is that, like, I think the things that we are questioning are also the things that I don't think the tools that have brought us to this problem are going to solve the problem. And so even the concept of personhood, I wish I was a legal scholar and I could speak to this more competently, but I'm not convinced that humans ought to be, treated as kind of a model type for survival, and that trickles down to law too, because we're just not very good at it apparently. When you look at species level, yeah, I don't know, I'm ranting at you guys now. So.
Can we talk about agency? We've sort of discussed this in the group's discussions previously, and there seems to be some kind of connection between personhood and agency, although not necessarily so. Rivers are persons, they're not necessarily agents. But still, it might be worth looking at the extent to which agency might play a role here. And Jacek, the robots and artificial intelligence applications that you devise, are they agents, would you say? And if they are now, or whether they are likely to be so in the near future?
Well, definitely they are agents, but with our definition of agents. So again, we in a sense, we are switching the topic from persons to agents, but again, the same situation is there. It depends on whom you consider what you consider to be an agent. And within computer science, and particularly within AI, we have quite well-established definition of an agent. That is an entity pursuing its goals, capable of performing actions in order to achieve or to strive for those goals. So from that perspective, and of course, you can then qualify it further, but that's the simplest definition of an agent. And from that perspective, even the thermostat in your heater is an agent, although very simple. So of course, I tend to think of my robots as agents. I tend to think of my programs, thinking programs, well, if it is thinking, as agents. And but in a sense, it does not have probably it does not address the consequences you are after.
Mm.
It has consequences for my way of designing those systems, creating them, and verifying whether they fulfill my expectations, whether they fulfill my design goals, or whether they just fulfill their reason of existing. But from that perspective, agency is, in a sense, from my perspective, prerequisite for personhood, but not sufficient. Yeah. There needs to be something more to it, much more.
So a necessary but not sufficient component.
Mm.
Gabriella.
Yeah, I think as an individual that comes from a cognitive science background, and the new kind of cognitive science, now that one that we heard earlier from Jonnie, that was aimed at formalizing everything and grounding everything on propositional logic. But kind of so-called second wave of cognitive science, or after the cognitive science revolution, as we call it, I think I can't fully agree with that. I mean, I agree that they are they do fulfill goals, but they have no intrinsic goals. And to me, that is quite at the core of the notion of agency. Bringing about changes in the world by pursuing some kind of intrinsic goals. So yeah, they fulfill your goals, but they are, it's meaningless for those programs. They have no meaningful relation to the environment. So somehow I think that agency is very inextricably linked to having a physical body that answers, that is regulated by homeostasis and thrives to maintain that. I mean, these entities, they are never under threat. Organisms have been subjected to challenges through evolutionary times and gradually have evolved adaptations to kind of fulfill those intrinsic goals of survival, of drifting towards simply feeling good and avoiding harm. And I think if as the student of the evolution of cognition, I think that also high-level cognition emerges from a very basic biological problem of solving homeostasis through millions and millions of challenges from the natural or social environment that ultimately kind of forced organism entities to adapt in order to continue their subsistence and to adapt towards finding more and more smarter and smarter solution and ultimately achieving flexibility. And I think that's the kind of operational definition that we use for intelligence or for high-level cognition in our field, flexible behavior that is quite straightforward deployed without requiring millions of trials, as perhaps an artificial intelligence entity requires nowadays to train towards a goal that is imposed from the exterior, and they are also trained within very to deploy their intelligence in a very narrow sense, within a very narrow context, while a worm, it's much more flexible than that, I think.
Pick up on something that was just said. I'd be curious from your perspectives, both of you, on digital decision systems as a conservative force, because I know like the US military now, like many militaries, are struggling with information overload. You know, they are investing heavily in AI and machine learning techniques because there's so much information out there, and they need to find the strategic needle in a haystack that'll matter, you know, terrorist signal or something like that. Point is, the infrastructure itself in that environment has led to kind of paralysis in a way because of overload. And I'm curious insofar as like intelligent behavior in this silo can lead to, or can dampen rather than boost intelligence, because it the feedback loop causes some kind of social cooling. So you've just said that like high level cognition is thought of as kind of interpretive flexibility and like the ability to respond intelligently. And what I see historically with AI is what people call social cooling, is this kind of people tend to operate in environments with sensory technology as if they're surveilled, because often they are surveilled. This changes what they're willing to express in public, because they might be in trouble for something. The kind of panopticon effect where thinking you're being surveilled will cause you to change your behavior. The question to throw back to you guys is like, do you see any analogous feedback loops where we are suppressing that which we are thinking we are boosting just because of infrastructure, the infrastructural layout of decision systems or digital technologies generally?
Well, probably you have already mentioned that in your talk, that the AI as it is evolving right now, it demands more and more resources. And those resources are not unlimited. So already at that moment, we see that we cannot afford in some situations more. We can, even if we wanted to teach, a system, even if I have an idea how to teach a system, I cannot afford such to compete for such resources as Google has or Facebook has in order to just tweak their recommender systems for ads. Meaning that, there is this limitation from the technological perspective. And the question is whether the goals that are pursued are, I don't dare to say my first thought, so let me rephrase that. I would spend resources on something else, let's put it this way. So yes, I feel that there is this limitation, and globally we see this or fight for more and more resources put into less and less useful output from my perspective. But I'm not sure whether this is the feedback loop you are talking or you are thinking about. But I was interested in because you mentioned, or you called AI right now conservative, or the decision making, and you then opposed it to revolutionary. So how would you see this revolutionary AI or revolutionary thinking in this context?
I'll respond to that very quickly, and then I'll pass back the baton back. But I think revolution is a change to this social order, and in my opinion, there wasn't a digital revolution. I haven't seen a social change, a significant change to the social order. I've seen a extension of inequality from the post-war period onwards, and I think a lot of companies get off and sell their products by saying AI revolution, fourth technological revolution, blockchain revolution, or whatever. And I mean, blockchain is a whole other conservative force, but I think also like the reason we're in this techlash moment is because technologists, I was speaking with someone during the break about technologists not having or having too much agency and not having to decide on infrastructure democratically. But to pass the baton back, I think some of this is to bring it back to personhood, about like what social licenses would help cut through what we are seeing as the kind of intellectual or infrastructural blocks that the ubiquity of digital decision systems brings about. A church is a person in the state of, or in the eyes of the law. I presume, right? So they have a different social license than a state, and they have a different social license than a university. And so if we run with that plurality and model what we know about ecosystems and kind of symbiotic relationships, what can we learn from nature about, you know, cohabitation and these things? I don't know. That's a different question I asked you before, but I'm kind of sending it back.
Yeah, no, I think it's like if you look back to my perspective, which is evolutionary, yeah, it comes with this energetic demands, but the kind of energetic demands that both of you mentioned, they are tremendous compared to the way we function and are able to accomplish much more than the most sophisticated artificial intelligence system nowadays. But I think that's also, I mean, we speak about the very slow process that led from worm thinking to orangutan thinking, and this evolutionary process had happened somehow. Well, we can think of loops, we can think of action and reaction forces here, but it happened organically. I don't want to sound dualistic by saying mind and body, because body and mind are one. But more sophisticated cognitive operations do require. This is something that there is empirical evidence for that, do require much more a higher energy expenditure. And as we probably is commonly known, that the brain is the organ in the body that requires most energy, and where we tend to locate these very complex cognitive operations. But I stress that it somehow happens organically, and inside I don't want to picture evolution as theological here, but what happens in this process is that there are trade-offs, and there are very smart solutions. So perhaps regions of the brain that are less useful to the organisms get atrophied, such as, for instance, in our case, the olfactory system, and other regions in the brains that we, for instance, employ for vision gets busted, and there are more neurons, more connectivity, and then there are even other regions of the brain are added, and different principles of brain processing, new principles of brain processing can appear that make up for or optimize this energy consumption. And one very smart design is what happens in the brains of the birds, who have very tiny brains. Like a raven, it's extremely considered to be among the most extremely intelligent creatures on Earth. But they have very tiny brains like this. And what happens there is that bird brains compress neurons. They have very tiny neurons, but they have a whole load of them, which makes that processing quite cheap, but extremely advanced. So I'm not sure that if that's reflected in how artificial intelligence is operating.
Engineering solution for AI.
Look at the raven brain.
I think those comparisons are interesting. I think as a lawyer thinking about responsibility, they make me a bit uneasy. Because as you said, those processes happen organically. And whether or not we start buying supercomputers does not happen organically. And I actually think this problem of drowning in our own competence in some way it's also not that new. I think since you brought in the history of administration, as anyone knows who works in a public institution or a private institution for that matter, administration itself is very much the same kind of trade-off. You start employing administrators, and before you know it, they're half of your institution's budget and sit in our nice university main building, where once philosophers sat and actually cognitive science, so actual work took place. And now, so I think that's a very similar problem, that a lot of resources suddenly get eaten just by administering things that originally we would be. So I'm not sure that that is new. I think in general, the question, the foundational question is, what do we want? The why question that we discussed in the break also. Why do we do what we do? And this answer of the tech companies to say, we can make the world a better place by investing all of this money or having blockchain, getting rid of all the lawyers, great. But I'm thinking, are those really the problems that we have? Or is it the lonely people who are in elderly care homes or the kindergarten places that we need, or someone who cleans up the immediate environment, or that people are drowning in the Mediterranean? So there's a lot of activism, I think, that goes on, and it's a little bit misplaced, I think. And even the discussions about personhood, now I'm going into my rant. There's a certain, to use another Vogue term at the moment, narcissism about it, on behalf of not just even our race, because as you mentioned, it's also used to alienate people who are part of the human species. But it is a type of thinking that starts with ourselves. And then we think, okay, does the machine match me, or does the corporation match me? Literally me, not even the species. And that, I think, I'm inherently suspicious of if you start comparing things to yourself in that manner. Because I think it risks overlooking, or in a phenomenological sense, taking in what is out there, as you mentioned. It closes you off from the beginning. And it lets you assign labels to things like corporations, which probably should never have been labeled persons. Or maybe that's the wrong, maybe we should have something completely different, a different term. I think from my point of view, it would be much better to just think in terms of responsibilities. Who cares what we call it? We call it agent or actor or person or entity or corporation. Thinking about it in terms of one part of the whole, I think I would feel more comfortable with than thinking, are you like me? And if not, don't grant you permission to use the title person. Coming, I think. Grand over.
Yeah. Let's one final sort of theme that we've been pursuing has been so we talked about the concept of personhood, we've talked about implications of personhood, and the final theme is that of control. And I want to just start out with a question for everybody to just problematize, because it could be argued, and lots of people make this argument, that actually corporations are extremely successful and have been able to generate enormous value for mankind, we can put it that way, because they have been able to operate autonomously and have had this freedom to pursue whichever activity they saw as most suitable. And that has actually been a tremendous boon for the world. You know, that this is a view that lots of people hold. And so one could also argue that perhaps because granting these entities the freedom and autonomy to pursue their own goals has been so beneficial to humanity, that then we could also grant freedom to other kinds of beings, artificial intelligent beings, that they could also use their autonomy in order to pursue objectives in a way that would be extremely beneficial for mankind and resolve a lot of the problems that we are facing. Is this something that chimes with you? Do you see that there is a need for us to control artificial intelligence, or is there a need, or is there a value in allowing these new entities to act as persons and to be autonomous in our world?
I just want to caveat that until the full, I don't know, like, yes, I would agree that corporations have brought about significant social change. Until we have the full audit of this period, I'm not convinced that it's a net. I don't like, yeah. My kids be able to swim on a coral reef? Probably not. You know, will their kids? Almost definitely. Okay. It's like there's pros and cons. I don't know. I think the rhetoric about mankind and the world and progress and technology is all pretty humdrum from in the views of historians of technology, because you can go back to any previous technology, look at the railroads or the internet or the phones, or it's always chest thumping, like this is going to get us, this is going to be the transcendent technological breakthrough. And I think the reason I like to explain this through political economy of the tech industry is you start to see who gains from these narratives and who these narratives serve, and how places, groups like us can get stuck in these kind of rhetorical traps where we're debating, pieces of a conversation that have been, pushed by industrial want. So AI ethics is like a domestication of critique. It's like, okay, well, if we're going to get critique, let's just like get them to talk about AI ethics, because that's, it's about ethics and choosing as opposed to like justice and criminal wrongdoing. But all of that to say, yeah, that, the way it was described to me once is that Silicon Valley made its name on, the internet initially, and then smartphone penetration, and after 2011, was this huge boon, and then social media, similarly huge boon. And since then, there's a new narrative that's needed to keep up that growth. And AI is one, blockchain is another, where it's like, this will be it. But I just think we have to be more discerning. The stakes are way too high to fall victim to solving Silicon Valley's problems. That's my rant complete. Thank you.
The answer is yes. Control, or rather, control is needed.
Yeah, there's a really good quote in an article called "Making Kin with Machines" by a bunch of indigenous scholars who also look at AI, and they say that man is neither the center nor the height of creation. And I think that is a good design principle as we look at the political economy we inhabit today, is like, are we sure that, to your point, we can mimic, or we should be mirroring decision systems, consequential decision systems on kind of parochial ideas of what a human, binary definitions of what a human should be. And I think the reason these conversations stall is like, oh, well, all of law would need to change, or all of technology would need to change in order to have a, kind of, what's the word, a kind of
Accommodate.
Yeah, to accommodate to significant change. And it's like, well, it honestly, this is where we will know revolution when we see it. It may be that some of these shortcomings are dealt with the way that historically they are dealt with, which is a lot messier than in conversation. And I hate to go down that road, but I see so much suffering these days that I hate more to ignore it. So I'll stop there.
Lashenka.
No, I wanted to ask a question. What else should we model it on? How do you, we know a little bit about who we are. So what else is there to model?
I think my persuasion increasingly is to learn from indigenous communities, as I've echoed a couple of times today, and that's partly from where I grew up in Western Canada on their land. But I think responsibility, accountability to place is important, to things like water and land, and to be in conversation with ancestors. I think part of the hype around technology is it takes the focus off of history. We get to look forward and fetishize the future as opposed to looking back and dealing with the ancestors that brought us here.
And the future is also the end of humankind. So it cuts us off from our past, and it actually cuts us off from our future.
Yeah, you're right. It isolates. That's a good point.
Well, just to continue that, when I spoke earlier about the ideas, well, in all texts, the ideas about the human, in Christianity mostly, the idea developed that the human is the top of the creation, which is not really there in the texts either. But the idea is more of not so much control in terms of dominating, but responsibility in terms of, again, governing, maintaining, and maintaining, again, not just your welfare, but the welfare of the nature and animals as well. So in that I agree with what you just said.
I don't think I have much to add to what Jonnie said. I think I also don't accept the premise. Yeah. I also don't, so the premise that corporations necessarily have done so many good things just because they were free. I think first of all, we don't know how good the things are that they've done, and the second thing is I think they are more free and less free in different parts of the world, and still it works. So maybe I've seen one theory that the consumption of science fiction literature is directly correlated to the number of innovation and inventions that comes out of countries. So maybe that is one variable to focus on rather than deregulation or personhood. I don't know, but control, yes, definitely. If in doubt, as a lawyer.
Any final comments from this side of the panel?
I just fully agree. I'm on that side of the panel.
Well, maybe from my perspective, I definitely am for control because there are all those doomsday scenarios about AI making paper clips out of us, or like the super intelligence book. There are many of them. There is this idea of singularity that will occur soon and will make us all pets. But I think that what we are discussing here in the panel is more moral question than anything else. So from the engineering perspective as mine, well, we are trying to create useful tools. And we are doing it within, well, we have some goal in mind. It may be, of course, a very simple goal, like to, well, help a paraplegic go, or to help, well, help me distinguish cats from dogs, if we think about that, or help some companies sell more ads. This is also just a tool. But the question is, why do we do it? And what is the way of navigating in this realm of possibilities? And for that, we need something more than just my personal responsibility. Apparently, if we put it in the legal system of artificial persons like companies, then it's not enough. Because, well, companies, in my personal opinion, are just devices to maximize the benefit, maximum for their owners. That's even though Google was designed or was devised originally as just a company helping people search internet, well, quite soon it developed into a company that has completely different goals. So control is important, but we need to control it on many different levels. And of course, engineering control on the lowest level is important. We need to understand how to do things, but we also need to think about why we are doing those things.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some, but not, unfortunately, not very. The conversation took us a bit further in time than I anticipated, but it's very interesting. Thank you all for this discussion. Are there any questions from the panel and also from the audience out there? I think I will go to my computer and see whether there are any questions out there. But first, please.
Short question, maybe about law primarily. I've been working in healthcare, and in Skåne we are on the verge of introducing a huge healthcare system. And one big problem has been the patient data law, because according to that law, you are not allowed to see the patient's chart in one position of the healthcare if it's created in another position. And then the question came up, is this system, which parts of it are considered to be an is this system, is the law system? because the system has all the information. And the system might present the information to the physician in one part of the system that he isn't allowed to see, because the system has all the information. And to make it more complicated, there might be information that is vital for the patient when he's meeting the physician in that part of the system. So it's the system, the law applicable to the system. There was something like that up before. How to talk about the IA in cost. So.
Yes, it could be a long discussion. We have 3 minutes. So I think I will just say by default, yes. The answer is always yes. And I get the question a lot when working with programmers or weapons developers who think we have a new weapon. Is the law applicable to it? And the answer is always yes, because the law is always applicable. There's no exception in the law that says new things are exempt. It's like the same with human acts, right? We don't, anything we can do, we don't wonder, oh, just because it's not explicitly forbidden to do X, that might, so there are general principles, general norms that cover this also, but we can take the details maybe later.
Any other questions from the audience?
I can ask a question.
Yeah, please.
So the discussion about rights and duties that you had before reminds me a little bit of some of the literature on citizenship. So we have concepts like ecological citizenship and sustainability science that denotes this shift from just rights and duties in relation to states and other citizens to also consider duties towards maybe nature or other non-human others, or people who might be distant in space or time, like future generations. So I wonder what's the relationship between personhood and citizenship?
Can I just throw one thing in it? That for me is why intersectionality is so important. Is like, rather than just have the person as one monolithic thing, I am a brother, I am a son, I am a partner, I am a student, I am a teacher, like I am many things in my identity. And I feel like the idea of the future of legal personhood that excites me is incorporating exactly what you've said and thinking about the multiple frames that make up a particular, the manifold of identity frames that make up a particular legal identity. And maybe because, you know, Google has data centers in these ecosystems, you know, these dozen ecosystems globally, they should have responsibilities as ecological citizens of those environments to make sure XYZ is accomplished. Like there's room for invention, I think, there.
On the specific question of the relationship between personhood and citizenship, I mean, citizenship is a legal status that normally regulates the relationship between a state and a human individual. There has been cases of citizenship, famously in Saudi Arabia, being granted to a non-human entity, to a humanoid called Sophia. I'm not sure that I'm not an expert in Saudi law, but I would presume that by granting citizenship to that entity, that brought with it some attributes, some rights, some responsibilities, some kind of status that normally is assigned to persons. There is also, I mean, there's no reason why there can be a state can't decide that a corporation can be a citizen as well, although that is normally not for reasons of democracy. That's normally not practice that's sort of allowed. But in theory, from a legal theoretical perspective, one could have citizenships being assigned to non-human entities. But personhood is a broader characteristic status than citizenship, because it's not just regulating the relationship with the state, but it's regulating the relationship also if in international law and in other sort of in relationships between persons, not just towards the state. Any? Any questions out there on Zoom? No, okay. All right, then that's very good timing because it's now 12 o'clock. So thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much to Jonnie Penn, first of all, for your talk and for sharing your ideas with us, and to all the panel. Thank you.
Thanks.